Maria Santos wiped down the grand piano in the university's main concert hall, her cleaning cloth moving carefully across the polished black surface. She had been working as a cleaner at the prestigious Berklee College of Music for 3 years, and every night she followed the same routine. Empty the trash bins, vacuum the carpets, dust the instruments, and make sure everything was perfect for the next day's classes. Her daughter Isabella often came with her after school, doing homework in the corner of whatever room Maria was cleaning. The girl was 12 years old, quiet and observant, always watching the music students practice through the small window in the door before her mother unlocked each room. Isabella had never touched a piano before coming to Berklee with her mother. In their small apartment in East Boston, there was barely enough room for their beds and a tiny kitchen table. Music lessons were something for other children, children whose parents didn't work 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. But Isabella was fascinated by the sounds that came from behind those practice room doors. She would press her ear against the wood and listen to scales, arpeggios, and complicated pieces she couldn't name. Sometimes she hummed along quietly, her fingers moving in the air as if she were the one playing. Maria noticed her daughter's interest but said nothing. What good would it do to encourage a dream they couldn't afford? She had her own dreams once back in the Philippines before life taught her that dreams were luxuries. Now she focused on practical things like paying rent on time and making sure Isabella had enough to eat. Music was beautiful, but it didn't put food on the table. Still, she couldn't help but feel a small pain in her chest when she saw Isabella's fingers dancing invisibly along with the melodies she heard through the walls. One evening in late October, Maria was running behind schedule. A pipe had burst in one of the administrative buildings, and she'd spent 2 extra hours helping mop up the water. By the time she reached the concert hall, it was almost 9 o'clock. Isabella sat on the floor near the stage, her math homework spread out around her, but her pencil was still. She was staring at the grand piano with an intensity that made Maria pause. The girl looked hungry, but not for food. It was a look Maria recognized from her own youth, a longing for something that seemed impossibly far away. Maria went about her work, but she kept glancing at Isabella. The building was empty now. The last professor had left an hour ago, and the security guard wouldn't make his rounds for another 30 minutes. The silence felt different tonight, heavy with possibility. Maria found herself slowing down, taking longer than necessary to dust the chairs in the front row. She watched as Isabella stood up and walked slowly toward the piano, her hand reaching out but stopping just inches from the keys. The moment stretched between them. Maria should have called her daughter back, reminded her not to touch the expensive instruments. That was the rule, the boundary between their world and this one, but something stopped the words in her throat. Maybe it was the exhaustion from the long day, or maybe it was something deeper, a tiny rebellion against all the things her daughter would never have simply because of where they were born and how much money they didn't have. Maria said nothing. Isabella's finger came down on a single key. Middle C. The note rang out in the empty hall, pure and clear. The girl's eyes widened and a smile spread across her face like sunrise. She pressed another key, then another. She didn't know what she was doing, had no training, no teacher, no understanding of music theory. But she listened carefully to each note, tilting her head as the sound faded into silence before trying the next one. Maria stopped pretending to work and simply watched. For the next 10 minutes, Isabella explored the keyboard. She made mistakes, pressed keys that clashed, created sounds that made her wrinkle her nose and giggle softly. But she also found combinations that pleased her, simple sequences that almost sounded like music. Her movements became more confident. She started using both hands, trying to recreate melodies she'd heard through the practice room doors over the past months. It was clumsy and halting, but there was something there, something that made Maria's heart beat faster. Then Isabella found something. Her right hand stumbled onto the opening notes of a melody that Maria recognized, a simple tune that students often practiced. The girl's face lit up with recognition too. She'd heard this piece dozens of times. Her fingers searched for the next note, found it, then the next. It wasn't perfect, not even close, but it was unmistakably the melody. Isabella played it again, slowly, concentrating hard, then again a little smoother. Maria realized she was holding her breath. The security guard's footsteps echoed in the distant hallway. Isabella's hands flew off the keys as if they'd burned her. She looked at her mother with wide, guilty eyes, but Maria just smiled and shook her head gently. They had shared a secret now, a small act of trespassing into a world that wasn't meant for them. As Maria gathered her cleaning supplies and Isabella stuffed her homework into her backpack, neither of them spoke about what had just happened. But something had shifted. A door had opened just a crack, and both of them had glimpsed what lay beyond. The next evening, Isabella didn't even pretend to do her homework. As soon as Maria unlocked the concert hall, the girl drifted toward the piano like a moth to flame. Maria watched from across the room, her mop moving slowly across the wooden floor. She told herself they would only do this for a few more nights, just until Isabella got it out of her system. But even as she thought it, Maria knew she was lying to herself. Her daughter had found something precious, and Maria didn't have the heart to take it away. Night after night, the pattern continued. Isabella would wait until the building was empty, then she would sit at the piano and teach herself. She had no books, no sheet music, no instruction. All she had were her ears and her memory. She recreated the pieces she'd heard students practicing, working out the melodies note by note. Sometimes she spent an entire hour on just 8 bars of music, playing them over and over until her fingers remembered the pattern. Maria would finish her cleaning and sit in the back of the hall, watching her daughter transform into someone she barely recognized. This focused, determined girl seemed older than 12. 3 weeks passed this way. Isabella was getting better, anyone could hear it. Her fingers moved more smoothly across the keys, and the melodies she played actually sounded like music now. But Maria's anxiety grew with each passing day. They were breaking the rules, and eventually someone would find out. She imagined losing her job, imagined trying to explain to another employer why she'd been fired. But every time she opened her mouth to tell Isabella they had to stop, she saw the joy on her daughter's face and the words died in her throat. Then one night in mid-November, everything changed. Maria was cleaning the hallway outside the concert hall when she heard voices approaching. 2 professors were walking toward her, deep in conversation about an upcoming recital. Maria's heart jumped into her throat. Isabella was inside, playing the piano. Without thinking, Maria dropped her mop with a loud clatter, the sound echoing through the hallway. The professors paused their conversation, looking at her curiously. Maria apologized profusely, making a big show of picking up the mop, buying precious seconds. Inside the concert hall, the piano went silent. The professors walked past and Maria rushed into the hall. Isabella was back in her corner, homework spread around her, pencil in hand as if she'd been studying the whole time. Her chest was rising and falling quickly, and her cheeks were flushed. Maria let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. That had been too close. She opened her mouth to say they couldn't do this anymore, that it was too risky. But before she could speak, Isabella looked up at her with eyes full of unshed tears. The girl didn't say anything, didn't beg or plead. She just looked at her mother with an expression that said everything. This piano, this music, it wasn't just a game or a passing interest. It was becoming part of who Isabella was. Maria felt something crack inside her chest. She thought about her own mother back in the Philippines, who had worked in a factory to send Maria to school. She thought about all the sacrifices that had been made, all the dreams that had been set aside. And she thought about what it meant to be a mother, to want more for your child than you had for yourself. Maria made a decision. If Isabella was going to play piano, she needed to do it right. She needed actual lessons, real instruction, someone to teach her properly. But how could Maria possibly afford that? The music teachers at Berkeley charged more for a single lesson than Maria made in a week. She lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of their small apartment, listening to Isabella sleep in the bed next to hers. There had to be a way. The next day, Maria did something she'd never done before. During her lunch break, she walked to the administrative offices and asked to speak with someone about music lessons. The receptionist looked at her with barely concealed surprise. Cleaners didn't usually come to these offices, didn't usually ask about programs. Maria felt her face grow hot, felt the familiar shame of being out of place. But she thought of Isabella's fingers on those piano keys and forced herself to stay. The receptionist made a phone call, and 10 minutes later, Maria was sitting across from Dr. Patricia Chen, the head of the piano department. Dr. Chen was a small woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and an expression that gave nothing away. Maria explained the situation, her words tumbling out in a rush. Her daughter loved music, wanted to learn piano, but they couldn't afford lessons. Was there any kind of scholarship program, any way for Isabella to study? Dr. Chen listened without interrupting. When Maria finished, the professor leaned back in her chair and studied her for a long moment. Then she asked a question that surprised Maria. How long had Isabella been interested in piano? Maria told her about the nights in the concert hall, about Isabella teaching herself by ear. She left out the part about actually touching the instruments, but Dr. Chen seemed to read between the lines. A small smile played at the corner of the professor's mouth. Dr. Chen said she couldn't make any promises, but she would like to hear Isabella play. Maria felt hope and terror in equal measure. This was a chance, maybe the only chance they would get. But what if Isabella froze up? What if she couldn't play in front of someone important? What if Dr. Chen laughed at the clumsy attempts of a self-taught child? Maria agreed anyway. They set up a time for the following Saturday, an informal audition in one of the practice rooms. Maria told Isabella that night. The girl's reaction was not what she expected. Instead of excitement, Isabella looked terrified. She had only ever played alone in an empty hall with just her mother watching. The idea of performing for a real professor made her hands shake. Maria held her daughter and told her she didn't have to do this if she didn't want to. But Isabella shook her head. She wanted to try, she was just scared. Maria understood that feeling perfectly. Saturday arrived cold and gray, with November rain beating against the windows. Maria and Isabella stood outside the practice room, both of them nervous. Maria had dressed Isabella in her best clothes, a simple blue dress that was getting too small but was still the nicest thing she owned. The girl's hair was pulled back neatly and her hands were scrubbed clean. She looked younger than 12, vulnerable and small. Maria squeezed her daughter's hand, trying to transfer courage she didn't really feel. Dr. Chen opened the door and welcomed them inside. The practice room was tiny, barely large enough for the upright piano and 3 chairs. The professor gestured for Isabella to sit at the piano bench. Maria took a seat in the corner, her hands gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. Dr. Chen sat in the other chair, her face neutral and professional. She asked Isabella a few gentle questions about what pieces she knew, but Isabella could barely answer. She didn't know the names of the pieces, didn't know who composed them. She had just heard them and learned them by ear. Dr. Chen nodded and asked Isabella to play whatever she felt comfortable playing. Isabella's hands hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. Maria's heart sank. This had been a mistake. The pressure was too much, the stakes too high. But then Isabella took a deep breath and began to play. The melody that came from the piano was simple, a beginner's piece that any first-year student could play. But there was something in the way Isabella played it that made Maria sit up straighter. Her daughter's eyes were closed and she swayed slightly as she played. The notes weren't perfect, her timing was off in places, and she hit a few wrong keys. But there was feeling in it, emotion that seemed too big for such a simple melody. Isabella played as if the music was coming from somewhere deep inside her, as if she was pouring her heart out through her fingertips. When the piece ended, silence filled the small room. Isabella opened her eyes and looked at Dr. Chen with an expression that was half hopeful, half fearful. The professor's face was still unreadable. She asked Isabella to play something else. Isabella nodded and started another piece, this one a bit more complex. Again, there were mistakes, technical errors that made Maria wince. But again, there was that quality, that emotional honesty that made the music feel alive. Dr. Chen let Isabella play 3 more pieces before holding up her hand. The professor stood and walked to the piano, standing beside Isabella. She asked the girl to play a simple scale. Isabella looked confused. She didn't know what a scale was. Dr. Chen showed her, playing it slowly. Isabella watched carefully, then tried to copy it. It took her several attempts, but eventually she got it right. Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully, then asked Isabella to play it in a different key. Isabella had no idea what that meant, but she listened as Dr. Chen demonstrated and then tried to recreate it. For the next 20 minutes, Dr. Chen tested Isabella in various ways. She would play a short melody and ask Isabella to repeat it. She would play 2 notes together and ask if they sounded happy or sad. She would demonstrate a rhythm and have Isabella clap it back. Through it all, Isabella struggled with the technical aspects but excelled at the listening and feeling parts. She could hear the tiniest differences in tone, could sense the emotion in the way notes were played. Dr. Chen's expression remained neutral, but Maria noticed that the professor's questions became more engaged, more curious. Finally, Dr. Chen stepped back from the piano and looked at both Maria and Isabella. She said something that Maria would remember for the rest of her life. Isabella had no technique, no training, no understanding of music theory. By all normal standards, she was far behind where a piano student her age should be. But she had something that couldn't be taught, a natural musicality and emotional connection to the instrument that was rare. Dr. Chen had been teaching for 25 years, and she'd only met a handful of students with that kind of raw talent. Maria felt tears spring to her eyes. Dr. Chen continued speaking. The professor said she would like to take Isabella on as a student. There would be no charge for the lessons. In exchange, Isabella would have to work incredibly hard. She was starting years behind other students her age, and catching up would require dedication and discipline. They would meet twice a week, and Isabella would need to practice every day. Did Isabella think she could commit to that? Isabella looked at her mother, her eyes wide and shining. Maria nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Isabella turned back to Dr. Chen and said yes in a voice that was barely above a whisper. The professor smiled then, a real warm smile that transformed her serious face. She told Isabella to call her Dr. Chen during lessons, but after lessons she could call her Patricia. They would start the following Tuesday. Walking home in the rain, Maria and Isabella didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Everything had changed in the space of an hour. Isabella was going to study piano with one of the best teachers in the city. It seemed impossible, like something from a fairy tale. Maria kept expecting to wake up and find out it was all a dream. But the rain was real, the sidewalk was real, and the feeling of her daughter's hand in hers was real. That night, after Isabella had fallen asleep, Maria went to the window of their small apartment and looked out at the city lights. She thought about the path her life had taken, all the doors that had closed, all the opportunities she'd never had. But maybe, just maybe, some of those doors were opening for her daughter. Maria didn't believe in miracles, but she believed in Dr. Chen's words. Isabella had talent, real talent, and now she would have the chance to develop it. Maria made a promise to herself and to her sleeping daughter. No matter how hard it got, no matter what sacrifices had to be made, she would make sure Isabella had this chance. She would work extra shifts if she had to, go without things she needed, do whatever it took. Because sometimes, just sometimes, dreams weren't luxuries. Sometimes they were necessities, as important as food and shelter. And her daughter's dream was blooming like a flower in concrete, finding its way toward the light. The first few months of lessons were harder than either Maria or Isabella had imagined. Dr. Chen was kind but demanding, and she didn't lower her standards because Isabella was starting late. The girl had to learn to read music, understand theory, build proper technique. Her fingers had to be retrained, bad habits corrected. Some days Isabella came home from her lessons frustrated to the point of tears. She wanted to play the beautiful pieces she heard in her head, but Dr. Chen made her practice scales and exercises until her hands ached. Maria watched her daughter struggle and felt helpless. She couldn't help with the music itself, couldn't read the notes on the page, or explain the concepts Isabella was learning. All she could do was encourage, remind Isabella why she'd started this journey in the first place. On the worst days, when Isabella wanted to quit, Maria would take her to the concert hall during visiting hours, and they would sit together listening to student recitals. The music always rekindled something in Isabella, reminded her of what she was working toward. Dr. Chen also noticed Isabella's struggles, but she saw something else too. She saw a girl who practiced more than any other student she'd ever taught. Isabella had no piano at home, so she had to find time to practice at the school. Dr. Chen arranged for her to have access to a practice room for 2 hours every day after regular classes ended. Isabella would rush there straight from her middle school practice until Maria finished her cleaning shift, then go home and study her regular schoolwork late into the night. She was exhausted constantly, but she never missed a practice session. 6 months into her studies, something shifted. The technical exercises that had felt impossible began to make sense. Isabella's fingers grew stronger, more confident. The notes on the page started to look less like random symbols and more like a language she could read. And most importantly, she began to bridge the gap between the mechanics of playing and the emotion she felt. The music started to sound the way it did in her heart. Dr. Chen entered Isabella in a small student showcase that spring. It would be Isabella's first real performance in front of an audience. Maria took the afternoon off work, something she almost never did, and sat in the audience of the small recital hall. There were maybe 50 people there, mostly parents and other students. Isabella walked onto the stage in the same blue dress she'd worn to her audition, the one that was definitely too small now but was still her nicest outfit. Maria watched her daughter sit at the piano, adjust the bench, place her hands on the keys. For a moment, Isabella looked out at the audience and her eyes found Maria's. Mother and daughter shared a look that contained everything they'd been through together, all the nights in the empty concert hall, all the sacrifices, all the hard work. Then Isabella turned to the piano and began to play. The piece was one by Chopin, a nocturne that Dr. Chen had chosen carefully. It was challenging but within Isabella's abilities, and more importantly, it matched her emotional style of playing. As the first notes filled the hall, Maria felt chills run down her arms. This wasn't her little girl stumbling through melodies anymore. This was a real musician, creating something beautiful and meaningful. Isabella's hands moved across the keys with grace and confidence, and the music soared. Maria wasn't the only one who noticed. Around her, she could hear the audience grow quieter, more attentive. People who had been fidgeting or checking their phones stopped and listened. There was something captivating about this young girl's playing, something that demanded attention. When the final notes faded away, there was a brief silence, and then the applause began. It was enthusiastic, genuine. People were smiling, nodding to each other. Maria clapped until her hands hurt, tears streaming down her face. After the performance, several people approached Dr. Chen to ask about Isabella. Who was this student? How long had she been playing? Dr. Chen told them proudly that Isabella had only been studying for 6 months, that she'd started from nothing and worked harder than anyone. The other professors looked impressed, skeptical even, until Dr. Chen showed them Isabella's practice logs. The numbers spoke for themselves. One of the people in the audience that day was Marcus Webb, a talent scout for the New England Conservatory's youth program. He approached Maria and Dr. Chen after the showcase and asked if Isabella might be interested in auditioning for a full scholarship to their pre-college program. It was one of the most prestigious youth music programs in the country. Maria felt dizzy, a scholarship to the New England Conservatory, for her daughter who had been playing piano for less than a year. Dr. Chen was thrilled but cautious. She explained to Marcus that Isabella was still developing her technical skills, that she had a long way to go. But Marcus shook his head. He said he'd seen thousands of young musicians and technical skills could be taught. What Isabella had, that emotional depth and natural musicality, was something you couldn't teach. It was either there or it wasn't. He'd heard it in every note she played. He wanted to give her a chance. The audition was scheduled for 2 months later. Dr. Chen intensified Isabella's training, but she also warned both Isabella and Maria not to get their hopes up too high. The competition would be fierce, and there were students who had been training since they were 5 years old. Isabella was still catching up. But whatever happened, Dr. Chen was proud of how far her student had come. Isabella practiced like never before. She practiced until her fingers cramped, until she dreamed in musical notation. Maria would wake up in the middle of the night and hear Isabella humming pieces in her sleep. The girl was obsessed, driven by a dream that seemed almost within reach. Maria worried about her daughter burning out, but she also recognized the fire in Isabella's eyes. It was the same fire she'd seen that first night when Isabella had touched the piano keys. The audition day arrived on a warm June morning. Isabella performed 3 pieces for a panel of 5 judges. Maria wasn't allowed in the room, so she sat in the waiting area, her leg bouncing nervously. 45 minutes later, Isabella emerged looking exhausted and uncertain. She had no idea how she'd done. One of the judges had asked her to replay a section with different dynamics, and she wasn't sure if that was a good sign or a bad one. They had to wait 2 weeks for the results. They were the longest 2 weeks of Maria's life. She tried to prepare herself for disappointment, tried to think of encouraging things to say if Isabella didn't get in. But she also couldn't help hoping, couldn't stop imagining what it would mean if her daughter, the daughter of a cleaner who had started playing piano less than a year ago, got into one of the best music programs in the country. The letter came on a Tuesday afternoon. Maria was at work when Isabella called her, sobbing so hard Maria couldn't understand what she was saying. Maria's heart dropped. Isabella hadn't gotten in. But then she heard the words through the tears, happy tears, joyful tears. Isabella had been accepted with a full scholarship. Full tuition, access to practice rooms, instruction from master teachers, everything. Maria left work early that day. She didn't care if she got in trouble. She ran home and found Isabella sitting on their front steps, the acceptance letter clutched in her hands, tears still streaming down her face. Maria sat down beside her daughter and put her arm around her shoulders. They sat there together for a long time, not saying anything, just being present in this moment that would change everything. That evening, they went to thank Dr. Chen. The professor smiled and told them this was just the beginning. Isabella had years of hard work ahead of her. But if she kept going, if she maintained this dedication and passion, there was no limit to what she could achieve. Dr. Chen looked at Maria and said something that made her cry all over again. She said that Isabella's talent was remarkable, but what was even more remarkable was Maria's courage in advocating for her daughter, in asking for help, in believing that a cleaner's daughter deserved the same opportunities as anyone else. A year and a half after Isabella had first touched those piano keys in an empty concert hall, she gave her first official recital at the New England Conservatory. The hall was packed with students, teachers, parents, and music lovers. Maria sat in the front row, wearing a new dress she'd saved up for months to buy. Beside her sat Dr. Chen, beaming with pride. As Isabella walked onto the stage, confident and poised, Maria thought about how far they'd come. From stolen moments in an empty hall to this, a real stage, a real audience, a real future. Isabella played that night like she'd never played before. The music flowed through her, powerful and true. She played with technical precision now, but she hadn't lost that emotional quality that made her playing special. When she finished, the audience rose to their feet. The applause was thunderous. Maria stood and clapped and cried, overwhelmed by pride and gratitude and love. Her daughter, her beautiful, talented daughter, was going to be okay, more than okay. She was going to soar. After the recital, as people crowded around Isabella to congratulate her, Maria slipped outside for a moment of air. She stood in the cool evening, looking up at the stars, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The late nights cleaning, the risks they'd taken, the doors that had opened. She thought about the first time she'd seen Isabella's fingers moving in the air to music she could only hear through walls. She thought about the decision to let her daughter touch those piano keys, the decision that had changed everything. A hand touched her shoulder. It was Isabella, who had slipped away from the crowd to find her mother. The girl didn't say anything, just leaned against Maria's side. They stood together in the quiet night, and Maria realized that this was what she'd been working for her whole life. Not for herself, but for this. For her daughter to have chances, opportunities, dreams that could come true. For Isabella to become someone who didn't have to hide her talents or apologize for her ambitions. For her daughter to be seen, valued, celebrated. The future stretched before them, uncertain but bright. There would be more challenges, more obstacles to overcome, but they had proven something to themselves and to the world. Talent could emerge from anywhere. Dreams could bloom in the most unlikely places. And a mother's love combined with a daughter's determination could move mountains. Or at least, it could move a girl from an empty concert hall where she wasn't supposed to be to a stage where she absolutely belonged. The journey had just begun, and Maria couldn't wait to see where it would lead. Like, share, and subscribe, don't miss it.